once I realized I wanted to develop people in real life instead of characters on a page, and that there was someone kind of behind the scenes who was scripting those experiences, right? Like creating training programs and leadership experiences.
Do it in a way that invites each person to engage with that in their own way.
What I tend to talk about is it doesn't mean we're changing the content for every person. That's not possible. But we're doing small things, small choices that make it feel as though the content is personal.
I think it's terribly important to insist on individual values.
Learning Culture Podcast.
Initiative, creation, all these things which we value. It's now possible to make organizations on a larger scale than was ever possible before.
Learning Culture Podcast.
Teach people to analyze the kind of things that are said to them.
What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the Learning Culture Podcast. I am your host, Andrew Barry, and this is a show about building cultures of learning inside companies. And joining me today is Lindsey Caplan. Lindsey is the founder and lead consultant at The Gathering Effect. She runs a company similar to mine and has a very similar approach to building training. In other words, to not really even think of it as training, but to think of it as transformation and to be intentional and thoughtful and methodical about how she does that. She has a very interesting background, which I will not spoil for you. You'll hear about that right at the beginning of the conversation, and it frames the rest of the conversation. You're going to learn three very practical things that Lindsey always focuses on in building learning experiences: motivation, structure, and humor. You're also going to learn about three common mistakes that people make in the space: stuffing the suitcase, personalizing at scale, and informing over engaging. And these things lead up to Lindsey's 2x2 matrix. I'm a huge fan of 2x2 matrices. And Lindsey's is a great one. And it's a really helpful framework for thinking about how to create engaging learning experiences. So this is a really practical episode. If you're listening to this, there will be an image of that matrix shared on YouTube. So make sure to check that out if you want to get deeper into some of this content. So yeah, with that, sit back, relax, and enjoy my episode with Lindsey Caplan. Lindsey, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Andrew. Great to be here.
I'm excited to dive in. So you've got this really fascinating background. You combine organizational psychology, learning and development, and then screenwriting for Hollywood. And that's obviously the outlier of the three. And so I'm curious, how does the TV writing experience, and maybe you can start by letting listeners know, a little bit about the shows you've worked on, see if anybody is familiar with those. And then, let's talk about how that background has helped you design better training programs.
Sure. Yeah, it's a very normal background, very, very common, right? So a long time ago, I worked in television in Los Angeles. I worked on a couple of shows like Curb Your Enthusiasm, Malcolm in the Middle. I worked for a company that bought and sold people's movies and television shows, learned a lot about how to write great material. And somewhere along the way, I decided that wasn't for me and actually found my way into learning and development once I realized I wanted to develop people in real life instead of characters on a page, and that there was someone kind of behind the scenes who was scripting those experiences, right? Like creating training programs and leadership experiences that affected people in a way. And, surprisingly, the skills are actually very transferable.
Yeah.
Meaning, in screenwriting, we're taught how to move people, and not just move people and affect them so they watch to the end, but how characters grow and change and develop. And obviously in our work now, designing leadership and learning experiences, our whole ballgame is how do we move people to take an action, to learn something, do something differently, to be affected, et cetera, et cetera. And so, a couple of those skills that I use now are thinking about motivation. So oftentimes we tend to think about in learning, what's the content that we want to put in there, but really what's sometimes even more important is thinking about what's motivating the people in the room. What do they care about? So thinking that through, asking the right questions of your stakeholder or your client to figure out someone's motivation so they would really care about being there and learning is really, really important. So just a deep understanding of human behavior and why we change and why we don't. There's a couple other things like structure. Structure is really important in writing, and structure is similarly very important in how we structure a learning experience. One thing that's similar is this idea of the rule of threes. In comedy, we're taught that the third thing is the funniest thing, like screenwriting in my background is the outlier. In learning design, we're taught rule of threes in terms of chunking, right? Like 3 topics, 3 things we're going to talk about. So there's a lot of similarities actually, and I think it's really helped me in this, next phase of my career.
That's awesome. And I'm sure there's a lot of, there's that similarity, but also a difference between the rule of 3 there. And
yes.
A lot of it is, and I think there were 3 things you mentioned that I want to go deeper on. One is motivation and your kind of focus on that. You put that front and center, and I think that's so important. Structure is another one. And then I don't want to call it humor, but, it's sort of like, maybe it is humor, like tongue in cheek, like kind of, this example of your background, like one of these is not like all the others, there's sort of like a humor element to that. So let's unpack those 3 things a little bit to go a bit deeper in terms of sort of some of the lessons and experience that you bring into the work you do now. So let's start with structure. So I feel like that's a good place to kind of actually know, what motivation is where it all begins. Let's start at motivation.
Sure.
For those, what should people be thinking about if they want, because everyone's motivation is different, so you can't prescribe the answer to this, but what should people be thinking about if they wanted to really understand the motivation and what motivational levers they have?
Well, I think when we think of motivation inside an organization, we tend to think extrinsic motivation, right? Like, so people are there to make money or get promoted, and that's the only thing people care about. That's why we're signing up for the learning program. And I'd say that feels like a very narrow view of humans in general. Yes, it is a lever, but I tend to focus on intrinsic motivation. And so what deep inside what we care about, because ultimately, if we pull on that intrinsic motivation, someone will carry that learning forward for us. We don't have to push them to do it. They're going to pull themselves. And so a couple of things come to mind. One is when we start a learning program, we don't often ask why people are there or what they want to learn or what's at stake for them. We don't tend to surface that. And I think that's a real missed opportunity to take a few minutes at the beginning of a class or a workshop, whatever it is, an offsite, and say, why are you here? What are you hoping to learn? Here's our topics. Now, which one is most important to you or what's top of mind? What does this make you think of? There's many reasons why that's important, but one is you're latching right away to what someone cares about, which makes the content more personal and sticky for them. And, in my screenwriting days, all we think about is why people are making the choices that they're making. What is motivating them to get to the next scene? What's the pull through? What's the need? We are nerds about why people do what they do. And those same lessons obviously apply here. I can give you one other example just real quickly on motivation, which I think is hopefully a tangible takeaway for folks. In screenwriting, we think about what the central question is of that movie or television show, right? So if you watch Severance, which I love, the central question might be, what is Lumen Industries? What is happening here? If you watch White Lotus, the central question might be, who dies at the end, right? And that central question keeps us engaged, keeps us watching until the end, keeps us interested. In our learning programs, I think we can create a similar central question that, again, keeps people motivated, pulls them in, keeps them paying attention, not to trick them, but to pique curiosity. So for example, in a manager training program, it might be like as simple as what's expected of you as a manager. It helps us clarify what we're going to learn, what we're going to take away, and also whether or not we've answered that question. So much to say there, but that's a start, hopefully.
Yeah, I love this. What is the central question concept? Could it be as simple as something like, how do I do this skill? Like let's say we're doing a course on like communication skills, or just say communication skills. And could that be the central question, or is that too broad?
I think it might be implied. What the central question is useful for the employee, but it's also useful for the learning designer or the stakeholder, because it gives us a boundary or scaffolding to tell us what should be included in that class or experience or what shouldn't, right? And so if you say, how do you do this skill? There might be 12 ways to do this skill, and that doesn't help us, so I would get more specific likely.
So we're workshopping live here, me and you. So what if you said instead, like you set up an example of a well-known person who communicates really well, and the central question is, how do they do that?
Yeah. Yes.
That works. Yeah.
And I'm going to plus that a little bit. We want to make sure, speaking of motivation, people care about who that person is, right? Like, so either there's social proof that that person is someone that they look up to, or it connects directly to them. So it has to feel personal. Yeah. But I think that's definitely an improvement.
Yeah. Cool. I like that. All right. So that's a really good one. Let's move on. You mentioned scaffolding. I feel like that's a good segue into structure. So what are some of the principles? What are some of the things you're always thinking about when it comes to structure?
Well, first we should have a structure. I think a shocking number, right? Just basic, right?
Yeah. I'll just throw it at the wall.
There's many reasons why that's useful. And by structure, I don't just mean like, here's an agenda. I mean, crafting kind of the narrative arc of, if we want to be really nerdy about screenwriting, the from to of the experience, but structure gives the brain certainty and tells people what they're going to experience and what to expect. So, to guide our listener or a watcher here, many things in our daily lives have structure. If you're a Peloton user, they tell you at the beginning of the class what the class is going to be like. If you go to a Broadway show, there's a playbill. So the airplane pilot comes on and says, here's what you can expect on the ride. So I think at the very least, we should, include, here's what you can expect. Here's how we're going to get there. Here's why it matters to me and you. And here's who you're going to hear from. So that basic structure is really important and helpful and often skipped. There's many, many different ways to give structure, but I think, that's one of them. I can go through several others.
I love this idea. I call it signposting in the work that we do, right? Like, I think that's a common one a lot of people will recognize. And I was just quickly looking up who said this, but there's a really great quote. Apparently it was Dale Carnegie in How to Win Friends and Influence People. And that quote is, tell them what you're going to tell them, then tell them what you told them. And I think that's just such a, right? It's like, here's what we're going to do. Then we do the thing. Here's what we did. And just repeating that, it almost feels like it becomes redundant, but it never does. The more repetition, the better.
Yeah, this skill of creating and leading learning experiences is a skill of influencing people, right? That's the skill. And it takes more than putting content in a slide deck. It takes skill in learning how to share information, how to communicate it in a way where people remember it, retain it, and want to use it. And this is why what we're talking about is relevant. And I would say often maybe not top of mind to most folks, but should be.
Yeah. Okay, so let's move on to the third thing. So we've covered motivation and structure. And the third thing you mentioned was, we sort of loosely called it humor, but it's also almost the unexpected, right? Like in your case, organizational psychology, L&D, and Hollywood scriptwriting, right? Like the third thing is not like all the others. So let's talk about that a little bit. How do you incorporate that into your training?
Yeah, so humor is an important element, I would say, to the experience. I tend to focus more on the storytelling aspect. For example, I tend to suggest and build classes based off of critical incidences happening in the business, which is a fancy way of saying stories and examples. So, part of my process is to interview or talk to some of the folks who would be in the experience or in the solution to understand what's going on for them, what's real, what's top of mind, and then build the class or experience based off that. One, it helps people feel heard, but it also makes the content feel more real and applicable, which is super important to making sure that the content is helpful to folks. So I would say more than humor, really the element I try to bring in is the storytelling, and practically speaking, opening the class or the learning experience with a story that directly ties to what people are experiencing is a way to get the head nod pretty quickly.
Yeah, that's really cool. I think this is a really nice framework for people to think about 3 practical ways that they can improve what they're already doing. And on that note, I'm curious, what are the common mistakes you see when you get brought in to come in and either redo or revamp the training, or to create one from scratch, and you're kind of looking at what they've done before? What are the common mistakes?
Yeah, I'd say there's several. I'll highlight 2. One is what I call stuffing the suitcase, which basically just means we have pumped this class so full of content, so full of everything that we could possibly want, that it's very, very hard for the average employee to retain and use what's in there. And I understand why this happens, right? I recall an experience many years ago where I interviewed an executive at a company, and they wanted to do a manager training, and they gave me 13 topics. And that's just not possible or plausible, because our brain cannot consume all of that from a cognitive load perspective. It's just not possible. So stuffing the suitcase is one. And the reason that happens is we tend to think efficiency over effectiveness, and they're not the same thing. So when we get clear on things like the central question, it helps us figure out which of the 13 topics needs to be included. And the advanced level of that is not even just sharing topics, but effects. Like, here's what we want you to do with that topic. Another, I don't want to call it a mistake, but maybe a misconception is that we can't personalize our training for our entire employees. There's no way we can personalize it if we have 1,000 people taking the same class. How do we do that? And I actually think that that's not true. We can personalize at scale. What I tend to talk about is it doesn't mean we're changing the content for every person. That's not possible. But we're doing small things, small choices that make it feel as though the content is personal. I'll give a couple of examples. But what I mean by personalization is that I feel emotionally connected and invested in what's shared. It feels relevant and personal to me. And that is paramount to making sure that we're not just informed, but engaged. So a couple of ways to personalize at scale, real simple ones we've probably seen before, is just to spend a little bit of time debriefing or digesting the content. What did you learn? What stood out? That reflection and application in our own words is really, really, really useful versus stuffing the suitcase of I'm going to push 13 topics at you. I can give more tips there, but I would say just, letting go of that myth is one I feel strongly about.
Yeah. This echoes a lot of our work and process as well, because it's so much of it sounds like you do is spending time up front with the business stakeholders, but also participants that may be going through the program, to really understand their context, and be able to then bring that, because I think that's what you're kind of talking about a bit with personalization, is if you can talk about the real world context of the people you're in the room with, and do it in a way, and I think this is where the art of what we do comes in, do it in a way that invites each person to engage with that in their own way, right? So it's you're personalizing at scale. Like, you don't have to change content. You're bringing people into the thing. So maybe for folks listening, I think we would be curious, like, what does your diagnostic process look like? Because that's often a stumbling block for people.
Yeah, I think it might be useful to share briefly the model that I use as kind of the
yeah, let's do that. The 4-quadrant.
Yeah. So in terms of diagnostic, I often get brought in to sometimes create programs from scratch. I'd say more often when an existing program is maybe not scaling anymore, or when it needs to switch audiences. Maybe you built it for directors, now it needs to be for VPs, or it needs to serve a different kind of business problem. And one of the first things that I tend to do is give people a common language to talk about what we might be doing, what we might do better. And that actually depersonalizes it. So it doesn't feel like we're attacking what they built, but more giving us a common language to figure out what we can adjust for next time. And so my model, basically, it's a 2x2 framework, and I'll describe it very simply or quickly. 2 axes. On the vertical axis is push and pull. So is the learning program or the change program being done at me, push, or is it done with me, pull? So how active, are the employees? Do they have control? Are they given a role? Things like that. Do they want to be there? The other end of the spectrum is one size fits all versus personalized, which we've been talking about a little bit, which basically means, is it about anyone or is it about me? And the real game changer here is that people feel seen. Right? They don't come to see you, they come to see themselves. And how much does it feel emotionally connected to them? Like, oh yeah, this is made for me. And so each of those axes map to 4 different quadrants, like any good 2x2. And we create 4 different kinds of effects: compliance, informing, entertaining, or engaging, which is that pull and personalized quadrant. Typically, I will review materials. Maybe I'll audit the entire program, come and sit in, and I'll say, here's where I think we're landing based on what I'm seeing. I'm seeing a lot of push, I'm seeing a lot of pull, whatever it might be. And then we'll figure out what quadrant do we actually need to be in. We don't always need to be in engagement. Truly, it doesn't always have to be like that. But if that's what we want that ownership, that long-term buy-in, behavior change, etc., we have to design for that to happen, which means not just content, but how we share the content. And so that's a little bit of where the language that I use, and I find it helpful when companies that I work with start to adopt that language and then sort of can all talk about things in a similar way.
I love that. That's incredibly powerful and simple to use, like any good 2x2 matrix. So yeah, and what you also, I think what you're saying as well is that it's a balance. You're not trying to engage, because that could probably be quite taxing on people. Every now and then there is the right time to push something and just inform, but maybe before and engage. So is it, you think of it like that as well, like getting a balance?
Absolutely. Part of the work is what do we need from the people that we're trying to affect? What's the best way to influence them? If we're creating a training to introduce a new, HRIS system, I think compliance is fine, right? Like, here's how to fill out an expense report. Compliance is fine. But if what we want is typically leadership skills, support with a culture change, some sort of big lift to move employees in a different direction, engaging is really what we want, because it's the most effective for the business long term, but truly it's also what the employees want. I was an internal employee for many, many years. I don't want to sit in these classes that I could have watched later or read in a book. I want to be engaged. I want to be seen. I want to be active. And so hopefully I'm able to thread the line and be kind of the voice of both of those parties to make these experiences more effective long term.
Yeah, I love it. Let's maybe kind of round this out with a concrete example of a recent project or one of your favorite ones that come to mind, where it could be something that you helped improve, it could be something you built from scratch, but just if you could help for the listeners and people watching on YouTube, bring to life that personalized pull, the engaging aspect of it. What's one project that comes to mind as a good example?
Yeah, I would say last year I worked with a large organization that wanted to redo their internal university. So they had sort of internal university where they housed a lot of their learning programs. And the one meant for mostly frontline managers, they felt like needed to be redone for various reasons. And so part of the process was to talk to employees, to review materials, to interview stakeholders, understand what's happening in the business, all the things that we should be doing. And the current state was very much kind of a traditional university feel, like sit and someone pushes information up at us. It felt like a lot of department overviews. And when I talked to employees, they said two things. This doesn't feel relevant to us because this isn't our department, or I don't know why I need to learn this material. But also they wanted to actually connect with and talk to each other in the program. And so based off of that, we actually created a 3-tiered program where the first tier was they're watching asynchronous classes that are meant to give them these kinds of department overviews. The second tier was a cohort style where they're actually learning from and with each other. And the third tier was actually an action learning program where they're working on a business project or problem and solving it based off of what they learned in the previous 2 tiers. And so the reason that we did that was this program was meant to break down silos that had developed in the organization and bring sort of two groups together. We thought, what better way to do that than to have them actually teach each other, work on a business project together, and elevate their status as new managers to feel important and needed in where the company was headed. So, that's one example, but yeah, I'll stop there.
Yeah, no, that's solid. And I like the 3-tiered approach as well. That really kind of stacks on top of the. And is that all done in a year, or is that 3 consecutive years? What is it?
That they're running through the program. It was a little bit longer than a year in total. And that's mostly based off of kind of resources within the organization, and those constraints. So it just depends. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, okay, Lindsey, so there's so much more we could get into here, but I feel like this has just been a really practical episode and really tactical for people. We've covered from those 3 ways, those 3 lenses to look at a program: motivation, structure, humor, or storytelling. And I think there's some things people can put into place there. 3, I mean, you just did the rule of 3 here multiple times, which is awesome. You shared 3 mistakes around stuffing the suitcase, personalizing at scale, the right and wrong way to do that, and informing over engaging, and how to do. And then I think that helped to introduce the 2x2 matrix. So really solid. I want to end this off with 2 random questions that you did not get ahead of time. The first one is, what's a great book that you've read recently or are reading now that you would recommend to people? It doesn't have to be about learning, but just anything that's recently inspired you.
Yes. There's a great book by an organizational psychologist named Allison Fregale called Likeable Badass, which is geared towards women, but doesn't have to be just for women, about how to increase their status and be both warm and assertive at the same time. And I thought it was very practical, very helpful, very sticky. And I'll also plug my own book that I'm writing and working on. I'm excited about that. So if I didn't say that, then that would not be great. So
yeah, no, good for you. Yeah, no, I love that. That's a great recommendation. And we'll include links to your social media, your website, all of that, so folks can keep up to date with the book and as it comes out. So just as a last closing question, Lindsey, why do you do what you do?
Oh, goodness. How long do we have? 2 things. Don't make me cry. I could cry. One is I had a mentor and boss, actually 2 of them, that changed my life and helped me sort of see this path that I'm on now that I didn't see for myself. And I try to pay their generosity forward, pay their learning forward. And 2, I think the deeper why behind my work is that ultimately this is about helping people feel seen and heard. I think that's really what we do when we create these great learning experiences or change programs, is that people feel like, oh, they get us, they care about us. And, ultimately I want to do that for both my stakeholder and also the people that we're designing for. So that's where I find the most intrinsic motivation and satisfaction from the work.
Love that. Lindsey, you strike me as someone with a lot of clear thinking and a really big heart behind what you do. So thank you for doing what you do, and thanks for joining me on the show.
Thanks so much, Andrew. Appreciate it.
Hello. I hope you enjoyed that episode. It's Andrew again with a quick message. If you'd like to support the show, the best way to do that is to leave us ratings and reviews where you listened. If you're on YouTube, hit the like and subscribe buttons and feel free to leave a comment. We love hearing from our listeners and viewers. If you're listening to this on Apple Podcasts, please take the time to give us a rating and leave a review. Once again, we love hearing from our loyal listeners. If you're listening to this on Spotify, please hit the follow button to make sure that you don't miss new episodes as they come out. See you next week for another episode of the Learning Culture Podcast. Thank you for listening.